So Matt, here we are in 2021, 80th anniversary of Citizen Kane.
That's right. Yeah.
Largely considered one of the, if not the greatest movies ever made. And thought,
Yeah, something we should talk about.
well, and I thought I should dress up for the occasion here, wear a nice shirt, got my cufflinks, to celebrate this.
Very
And
classy.
I thought we should also really class it up with some good wine. So we have some
What do you have?
Paul Masson. Paul Masson will sell no wine before it's time.
Ah, the French champagne has always been celebrated for its excellence.
Well, this is the American Marsala. So
All right,
we'll open it up here and see how it is. If
Makes a good chicken
did
dish,
Orson
too.
Welles do us wrong when he was hawking this while under the influence back in the early '80s?
Action, please. Action, Orson, please.
It doesn't do anything?
No, sorry, cut.
Well, this is actually not technically champagne because it wasn't champagne that he was
Yes,
trying to
it
sell.
was a French champagne.
as good as French champagne.
As good as.
Yes.
That's right.
Ah, the French champagne has always been celebrated for its excellence.
Whatever it was, Orson Welles,
Charles Foster Kane, may his media empire continue.
yes, indeed.
It is
There's a theme here.
it's not great.
It's quite.
I can see how Orson Welles got drunk on this stuff.
It's quite medicinal.
Ah, the French.
I'm Nate,
Matt.
and we're here today on Deep Focus to talk about Citizen Kane in honor of its 80th anniversary.
Yeah, this is inevitable, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I know I haven't seen it, but Mank was nominated for a bunch of Oscars this year, and
Yeah.
so there's been kind of just a resurgence of it. This is one of those movies that does need to be talked about. It was for decades always voted by Sight and Sound's illustrious survey every decade, and was voted the greatest film ever made. And then this last time in 2012, it was knocked down to number 2. The Film Critics survey put Vertigo at number 1, and the Filmmakers survey put Tokyo Story at number 1.
Yeah, that's right.
So we'll see in 2022 if it can reclaim its throne. But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe we just start with this as this question about the greatest film ever made.
It's
It's a weird title to kind of say. I mean,
It's kind of a silly question to begin with, right? I mean, just to name one film as the greatest is a pretty tall order in and of itself. I mean, it's such a subjective thing ultimately for people. I mean, I think we've always made that distinction between, best and favorite, right? And this is kind of where this film falls into that camp, where you can recognize how influential this. It's the wine.
There is a California champagne by Paul Masson, inspired by that same French excellence.
it's effective.
Obviously, this film was very, very influential, and made a tremendous impact on cinema as a whole and how films are presented in the language of cinema. So, in that sense, you can understand why it's named as the greatest film ever. Very, very revolutionary for its time. And looking back at it, even now, understanding the context of when this film was made, it's pretty startling stylistically.
Even 80 years later, I think it actually is incredibly bold and fresh, right?
Yeah.
I would say if you show this to a young person today who's maybe not super into movies, or even somebody who's maybe getting into movies but doesn't have like a lot of film history background, if you threw it at them and said, this is the greatest movie ever made, I don't know that they would respond to it as that. They probably would have a lot of confused why.
Yeah,
I even kind of had that when I first saw it back when I was probably 14.
Even when I watched it again this time, I'm like, yeah, that's a great film. But I mean, greatest film ever made. I can think of several films I I would put above this one.
Right. I mean, is it a top 10 film of all time? Absolutely. I think it is.
I think that's fair.
Because, it is revolutionary and it's incredibly important. It's also extremely good. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
it is
an extremely good movie.
Yeah.
But I think part of the revolutionary aspect of it is also as much on what took place off screen, right? Famously, this is a fictionalized telling of William Randolph Hearst, the big, huge, massive media empire.
And a conglomerate of other people too. But
Yeah, I mean, he's the main inspiration. Yeah, I think McCormick, I can't remember his name, but was one of the other famous kind of titans of American industry in those early decades of the 20th century that they took from. I think more of the opera hall was from him. It wasn't from Hearst.
Yeah, Hearst was the main influence, though.
But well, just the idea of the yellow journalism, and they clearly the whole idea of getting into the Spanish-American War.
Read the cable.
Girls delightful in Cuba, stop. Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
So it's clearly taken from it. And I think big part of why people, especially baby boomers, I think like this movie and why it was such a huge thing for that generation of film critics and filmmakers is that it was the first American movie that really broke a lot of conventions. Was obviously revolutionary in terms of its cinematography, its editing.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
And a Happy New Year.
But also
the nonlinear storytelling.
Yeah, but also I think it was the fact that it said I can go ahead and I can attack an incredibly powerful figure head on and get away with it.
Yeah, which is what I think a lot of great art has tried to do over the years, and maybe this is one of the first examples of a real mainstream film being that bold, right? Especially a studio picture. I mean,
that might be its most revolutionary impact, is that it actually opened up for films the parameters on which you could make a movie, right? I mean, you didn't have the sense of, well, I can't touch about that, I can't touch about that. After this, I mean, there was, obviously World War II comes, and so things kind of tamped down, but once this movie gets to be more rediscovered following the Second World War, it does become this sense that you can start pushing things. And I think once you see in the 60s especially, is when you start breaking down the studio system, and you can do a lot more of this innovative filmmaking and bold subject matter. This movie is probably the thing that a lot of people look to and turn to inspire them to do that and say, aha, well, this is what movies can do. And that's not a small feat. That is something to celebrate, and that is something to hold up and really kind of rejoice, right, as a work of art.
Yeah, and we should talk about the accomplishment of Orson Welles, just on a personal level too. Making this picture. It came out of stage theater, of course, and
radio.
Radio, yeah, and that always, I think, more traditional theater was really ultimately his passion more than films. And you can see that, and even the actors he used in the film were the Mercury Theater players, right? So he comes from this very kind of prestigious, accomplished theater background, even for a young man. And he was only in his mid-20s.
25, famously 25 years old, his first movie.
Which is absolutely incredible. And a lot of the studios were courting him and trying to get him to come out to Hollywood, and he was fairly resistant to it at first. And here's this kind of this wonderkind, right, that all the studios were clamoring to get a hold of. And eventually had a deal with RKO Pictures, which is, of course, now a defunct studio. But, he just had Final Cut. He had full directorial control, which was unheard of at that time. And he went through several ideas, I think, kind of were gestating before this one came to life. And he was out there even shooting test footage for the film that ultimately ended up being the film itself, right? So it was made under kind of a shroud of secrecy as well. So there's some interesting, obviously, history to the film, and the background behind this film is even more interesting than the film itself.
Yeah, well, they made a couple of documentaries about it. They made the HBO RKO 281, which they made as a movie. It's not that good of a movie, by the way.
Yeah.
But they made a movie about the making of the movie. So, and of course now they made it again with Mank, right? So maybe a good place for us to start is just with the story and with the screenplay. So Welles obviously stars, produces, directs, but also co-writes with Herman J. Mankiewicz, who is the brother of Joseph L. Mankiewicz, a very accomplished filmmaker and writer in his own right. But the screenplay here is really, I think, a big part of its success. It's a very inventive way of telling a story that gets at the what you can do with movies that you maybe hadn't really seen a lot of movies try to do, especially American movies try to do before this. There's the bold move to kind of satirize those old newsreels with the
News on the march!
Yeah, and
tells you the whole story.
tells you the whole story of the film.
It tells it to you in a chronological order, which then is a really smart move because I think audiences would have, especially at that time, needed something to anchor what the heck am I watching, where does this fit? Because all of a sudden the movie goes back and forth. You have these reporters that are trying to make sense of the last words of Charles Foster Kane, Rosebud, one of the big plot holes of all time. How does anybody know what he said if he was alone when he died? But whatever.
Yeah, and the nurse came into the room, yeah.
Move along. We won't follow that. Well, evidently the butler was just sitting around there too, because he shows up at the end saying that he had heard him say Rosebud.
He said all kinds of things that didn't mean anything.
But anyways,
whatever.
You just kind of ignore that. But you have this whole kind of almost, I think Pauline Kael said this is a detective story in a sense, that they're trying to piece this together. But they do it in these fragmented ways, which makes it really ultimately an exploration of a human being. And that is what's so great and fascinating about this movie.
And through the lens of all these different people, right? All these people that were a part of his life and that were influenced by him positively and negatively. And kind of this idea of the unreliable narrator, right? I mean, what is the truth? Who is this person? And that's where ultimately I think the film fails to connect on some fundamental levels, is because the character is so mysterious, and he's supposed to be, right? We never really know who Charles Foster Kane is truly, and I don't think any of the people in the film that knew him could ever claim to have known who he really was either. Mm-hmm. So there is this sort of veil over everything as the film progresses, and it keeps the audience at a distance too, but we're still leaning into the picture, and we're wanting to discover these details and kind of fill in the gaps, because the newsreel tells us quite a bit, but doesn't tell us, we don't get the sense that it's telling us the real story, right?
Well, I don't know if I would quite say I feel like the movie doesn't succeed. I think that is its point, right? That it's trying to say you can't, and it sets up this bizarre premise. The reporter has this idea that, well, if I can find out what Rosebud means, that can tell me everything. And the movie's point is, no, you can't. And you get at the whole influence. I mean, in many ways, something like Rashomon from Akira Kurosawa, not quite a decade later.
Yeah, quite a bit after this, but
and
similar effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that Kurosawa specifically was influenced by this, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was, because it does have that same sense of, well, how am I trying to make sense of this?
Rashomon was based on I think a short story, even.
Right, but in terms of film,
in terms of a cinematic influence, I can see that.
Yeah, in terms of like a film structure and kind of even just the willingness to try these things, right? I mean, I do think some level this thing seeped out over that next decade into all these other areas where people felt like I can do stuff.
Yeah.
But I just think that the fact that it does create this very silly premise. Oh, one word might explain who this man was.
I'll get on it right away, Mr. Olson.
Good. Rosebud, dead or alive?
It'll probably turn out to be a very simple thing.
I mean, the whole point is to say, no, it can't. And even at the end, when it does finally reveal what Rosebud is, which famously, I think everybody knows now that Rosebud is the sled, it's almost done like in a specific point of saying, you still don't know, because you have the whole speech from the reporter saying, well, I suppose we never could have really found it out. It's just one piece of the puzzle you can't really figure out.
Maybe it means nothing.
Yeah, right? And then it goes into showing it, and then everyone's like, oh, now I know it's about, and then the way people try to interpret it, and you hear so many interpretations of it.
Yeah.
And it is, I think, almost a brilliant, maybe it is like the first troll in Hollywood history, where like Wells is trolling you, saying like, I just told you you can't do this, and then I throw it out there saying, haha, here it is, and then everyone's like, aha, and he's like, no, you idiots, I just told you you can't figure this out from one word.
It still doesn't have the weight you want it to have, right? I mean, the obvious implication is that, oh, he's pining for his lost childhood, right? I mean, he was basically sold off in a matter of speaking.
They come into some kind of money. We don't really know what it was.
It's like
they
a gold
struck oil
mine
or whatever.
Yeah, it's like a gold mine deed, I think, and and his parents feel like they don't have the resources, or not the resources necessarily, but the best environment to raise him. It's implied that his father's abusive, and the mother, finds this as a way to get him out of the situation, right? And that, begins his life as really, kind of a person that has no barriers, right? And he's free to pursue what he wants to pursue because he has kind of the unlimited pocketbook. So he takes over a newspaper.
Right.
And I think that's why it resonates with a lot of people today too, just this idea of the media conglomerate, right? How the media can influence public opinion, influence how we perceive events. And, Orson Welles, I think, really understood the dark potential of mass media.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you just mentioned how it is prophetic. I mean, I think this is a movie that is perpetually relevant.
Yeah.
And I remember when I saw it back in the late 90s was the first time I saw it, and you could associate it with Ted Turner or Rupert Murdoch. Now you could associate it with a Jeff Bezos or Donald Trump, I mean, all these different figures that kind of rise up in these. I mean, it does
there's a lot of surrogates here.
It taps into a great truth about power, a great truth about politics. I mean, people talk about capitalism, like the false promises maybe of capitalism and stuff.
And even the dangers of isolationism too, the fact that he ends up alone, kind of surrounded by all this wreckage, in Xanadu.
His false little paradise, but
yeah, and this coming right before World War II, of course, yeah.
Yeah, well, let's maybe revisit just some of the filmmaking elements here about why it's so revolutionary. I mean, obviously the script and the story structure is a big part of it, but even just the filmmaking itself. It's famously, Greg Toland is the cinematographer. As a matter of fact, a real crazy move that the directing card is shared between him and Toland. He puts the cinematography right up there with him as director and producer.
And rightfully so. I mean,
nobody ever did that kind of stuff, and it's a tribute to what he saw Toland's contributions to be.
Well, even the way the film opens with basically just the title screen, which is pretty
and no
much
music,
unheard of.
right? I mean, it's just this blank silence, and then this very Bernard Herrmann's score is just a wonderful score on this. That brooding thing, and it's it's kind of just bringing you behind the curtain. It's almost like
endless dissolves.
Getting closer and closer. You're kind of trespassing on private property. And getting into the inner life of this man, but you never really get into there. That's the thing. You never really actually get into it, and that's what the movie was. It's all those opening shots tell you everything you need to know about the movie.
Yeah, and when we see the snow globe, and that's kind of telling us that we're looking at this through a lens, right? Both literally and figuratively.
Right.
And this is
a shattered lens.
Exactly.
Right?
So this is altered reality, and rightfully so. I mean, this is a man that probably never really understood himself on some levels.
That scene with so mise en scène is one of the big theories in film, right? So you have montage, which kind of the idea that you'll arrive at truth through the way you edit things. And then you have the mise en scène, which is the more the idea you'll arrive at truth by allowing longer takes and allowing the actors to do more, and you kind of get to explore the set by just kind of looking at it. This obviously is in the mise en scène camp, and this deep photography allows for that. And that opening scene where you have, I guess not technically the opening scene, but I guess the opening flashback scene where you really get to first explore Charles Foster Kane as a kid is just one of the most astonishingly great bits of staging I've ever seen in a movie. The deep focus obviously is probably about, you're maybe looking at 70 or 80 feet from the camera to everything in focus throughout that.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how difficult that is, to expose.
The amount of light that's involved.
Yeah, to expose that level, that distance on photochemical film and that level of focus is exceedingly difficult.
And to have it not be something that seems so obvious, I mean, you don't really necessarily feel like you're paying attention to the fact that this is happening. Deep focus can be one of those things, if you don't have somebody who knows what they're doing with it, that it becomes very distracting.
Yeah.
And almost you go like, why is that in focus there?
Well,
this all works.
Yeah, you have to place, elements in the frame in such a way that still guides the audience to look at the right things, right? So traditionally, a longer lens shot, where you have the bokeh or, the background's out of focus, obviously you're being told what to focus on. In deep focus, you can't do that. So It's a matter of, where do you place the characters? What's the composition like? What's in the foreground? What's in the background? And it's just so beautifully done here.
Well, just to have the fact that they not only have like a camera locked up, but they even move the camera and keep things in focus. And those are big cameras. Those aren't these little cameras we have today, right? There's these massive cameras that are doing this.
Yeah.
It's not, nobody could do it today. I don't think you even have the talent that could try to actually pull that off today.
Yeah.
But I love it because like there's so much depth and meaning in every composition here. And that scene, I think, really demonstrates it because they're debating over Charles. And they're telling you that visually because he's right in the background through that window. And you have the dad on one side, you have mom, and then Thatcher on the other side. And so you just have this wonderful way. And then when they cut again into just the scene when they come outside to talk to Charles, and the way he's being, kind of engulfed by everybody, and the way they just compose it, like everyone's kind of coming over him. Yeah. He's losing his power as they're just deciding his future. I love that kind of filmmaking. I love that kind of idea that a director is going to visually communicate to you what something means through how he composes. Yes, there's dialogue that's helping you understand it, and the performances help it, but the story is so much conveyed through the visuals, which is what cinema should do.
Yeah, you almost don't need the dialogue, right? You can kind of understand what's happening just visually. And but the mise en scène, I see that as an extension of Orson Welles' theater experience again. Just this idea of being comfortable with longer takes and having actors that are comfortable with longer takes.
Well, I think he even said something to the fact that this is later on in life when people are asking about his filmmaking, and he just said it's easy if you're cutting, right?
Yeah.
What separates the men from the boys, I think he said, is if you can actually hold the take and keep it interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and it takes pretty talented people to make that work. But yeah, it's visually very, very striking too. Of course, the use of shadow and very high contrast lighting. I mean, I think of the scene in the screening room.
Yeah, they're all dark. You can't see a thing.
Yeah, and those are actually, I guess, actors that play other parts in the film, but you can't see them because obviously they're in darkness. And I actually think some of those shots were some of the test shots that I had mentioned before, and they actually just ended up using them in the film. But I think any studio had, at that time, would look at that footage and say, you got to reshoot this.
Yeah.
Like, we can't see anybody. But it's obviously intentional. It's beautiful, and it's very, very, very effective.
Yeah. Right alongside the great cinematography is, of course, also great production design. I mean, every set in this is extraordinarily wonderful. And it wasn't an expensive production, so part of the success of making it seem so great and grand is through the production design, the way they just set stages, right? I'm thinking about this later on as you're kind of seeing his marriage unraveling, and he's in Xanadu, and you have this massive estate, but they don't have the ability to make massive sets. What do? They have this larger-than-life fireplace. Just simple thing, but it makes you feel like I am in a place, I've never seen a fireplace that big in my entire life, right? And so you just kind of get the sense of, well, this must be like this huge, massive estate. They don't have any, the set's really not much. It's a fireplace.
Yeah.
And then they have some little things in the foreground. But it's just a smart idea of how do you dress a set to convey something to your audience, right?
Well, even just the idea of using all these crates, right? Just to imply all these possessions. You're not really showing the possessions necessarily. And there's a lot of stuff that is actually shown, but it's more a suggestion of wealth versus actually depicting it, fully. But it does remind me of the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, clearly an inspiration for it.
Yeah.
I mean, this, again, we talked about the inspiration. Some of it's more subtle, like just the fact that I think certain films may never have been made. People may not have dared to try to do certain things. But there's obviously very clear homages. Raiders of the Lost Ark is one. The early seasons of The Simpsons, I think that's actually, I first probably knew this movie from The Simpsons. Because you have a lot of Mr. Burns. There's the whole, when he actually runs for governor, they clearly are taking from the speech from Kane, which is one of the most brilliant bits of speechifying I've ever seen. If Orson Welles had wanted to be a politician, he probably could have been elected president, because he just is a great speech giver.
The working man, and the slum child know they can expect my best efforts in their interests. The decent, ordinary citizens know that I'll do everything in my power to protect the underprivileged, the underpaid, and the underfed.
Well, let's talk about just the performances, because I think this movie is great. It does have some really good performances. Actually, not a lot of famous actors in it. A lot of them didn't go on to other
Joseph
things.
Cotton, it's pretty much it.
Yeah, Joseph Cotton's very good in this. He plays Leland, his good friend.
Essentially, yeah.
You know, they come into the business together, kind of idealistic, and they are going to be the working man. And
Write out the tenets of the company, basically.
Right, yeah, he has. But then Kane goes down the road of sensationalism. You know, he brings in the whole new crew of people that he buys out from the other newspapers. And
what's our circulation number, or what's our number of Twitter followers? Yeah,
pretty much what he is, right? And so that's what he's creating. And you see, Leland becomes basically the conscience, and that great scene of confrontation between the two of them, right? When he's talking about the working man, like the man's going to want his rights. You know, you're what you are, Kane, is going to fade away.
You talk about the people as though you own them, as though they belong to you. Goodness. As long as I can remember, you've talked about giving the people their rights, as if you could make them a present of liberty.
And Kane doesn't listen to him, doesn't follow it, right? And eventually does fade away. So that's a great relationship. The other great relationship is with Bernstein, right? Everett Sloane, who I don't know if I can think of anything else he did other than stuff with Welles, but I love him in this. I think his might be the most impressive performance of the bunch. I mean, I really believe him as an old man. More so than Welles, or Cotton. Neither of them really quite sells me on the old man part, but he does.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, I mean, the makeup is pretty good in this film too, but I always do struggle with Orson Welles as an older man. It doesn't quite sell it entirely, but it works well enough.
It's too mannered, I think. I don't know. You're right. It's something about it doesn't convince me either, and I can't quite figure it out. There's something with his posture or his movements, like especially that scene where he's tearing apart.
It's unintentionally comedic a bit.
It goes on forever. Yeah, I guess he cut himself when he was doing that.
That's
scene.
right. Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like an old man tearing apart. It seems like a 25-year-old pretending he's an old man tearing apart this scene.
Yeah, I mean these are nitpicks ultimately, but yeah, it has a bit of it's a bit too awkward.
Right.
Yeah.
But I will say, I think Welles overall does give a good performance. I mean, particularly that there's that kind of a dastardly charm in his earlier scenes.
Yeah, especially in that first scene where we really see him, right? That really long take where he's revealed from behind the newspaper, right? I love that scene, and about him creating a war in Cuba or whatever he's talking about, and he has this kind of dastardly sort of. Kind of a cynical look on the world already, right? Which is interesting because he seems to be quite ambitious and youthful and wanting to make his mark, but he seems to understand the power of media in particular, but also kind of his, I think, ultimately political trajectory that he's on.
As Charles Foster Kane, who owns 82,364 shares of public transit preferred, you see, I do have a general idea of my holdings. I sympathize with you. Charles Foster Kane is a scoundrel. His paper should be run out of town. A committee should be formed to boycott him. You may, if you can form such a committee, put me down for a contribution of $1,000.
My time's
On the other hand, I am the publisher of the Inquirer. As such, it's my duty, and I'll let you in on a little secret. It's also my pleasure to see to it that decent, hard-working people in this community aren't robbed blind by a pack of money-mad pirates.
And he wisely understands that controlling the media is probably the first step in making those other ambitions come true.
Well, that scene with Thatcher there's, I think, really good because it does set up a lot of where the character will go without telegraphing to you. I mean, I think that's one of the real successes of this film is thematically it's complex and its characters are complex, and so it's not immediately obvious where they're going to go, what's going to happen. Even when you've seen it, partly because of the fractured structure of it, you're not really always understanding what is the motive here or there, right? Mm-hmm. Why does he eventually get seduced by this singer and kind of fall that when he's got so much power and he's got so much to lose by it? And you're never really fully understanding why, right? And I think that's why it does work so well. Yeah. But that early scene does kind of show that in a certain sense, he is, by his very nature, a megalomaniac, right? I mean, it's like I could lose $1 million this year. What do I care?
Yeah.
I might
I've got
do it next year.
65 more or whatever.
You know,
yeah.
so just that, and then even the scene when he does bring in all the new writers and the whole new approach to the magazine, there's a kind of just fun. I'm just having fun. I get the showgirls out, and you know the brilliant, again that whole sense of how smart it's composed. It's telling you that Leland and Bernstein are going to be divided over him because he keeps being always framed right in between the two of them, and even
the
when
reflection in the window.
the reverse shot gets the same thing. It's just such good, intelligent, thoughtful filmmaking, and I wish we had more of that in movies because that's why a movie I think like this can last and can continue to be inspiration for people.
Yeah, it's definitely ahead of its time, and it'll continue to endure, and it should. I mean, it's cemented its place in cinema history, no question about it, and it deserves to be there. But you almost have to warn people though before they watch this. Like, it's called the greatest film ever made, but don't expect it to be. But appreciate it for what it is, and there's a lot here to really admire.
I would agree. I think one way you can look at this movie is it's influential, it's groundbreaking. And it's relevant. I mean, it's constantly relevant. And I guess if any movie can make those claims, you rightly have to say it's essential filmmaking and essential film viewing, right? I mean, if you want to know and understand movies, you have to see this movie.
Yeah.